She rocks in a chair that remembers the shape of other hands. The mansion holds its breath around her. High ceilings that swallow sound, curtains that never quite meet, floors that echo each step like a question. Amanda slides her palm beneath the thin dress, feels the small, sure movement of the life inside, and whispers, as if the house itself could overhear and be persuaded. We will be fine. Outside, in a cramped flat 3 streets away, Amarka counts folded notes with fingers used to folding resentment into neat stacks. The room smells of oil and fried plantain. The radio plays too loudly to be able to hear the clock. Every bill is a small victory. Every unpaid debt, a ledger of slights. She glances at a photograph stuck to the wall. Amanda in a sharp suit, hair pulled back, the city bending at her shoulders. Amarka smiles without warmth. She has a plan that looks like survival. Jacob wakes before dawn the day Amanda is due. He walks to the garage where the tools are arranged like a confession. He smells petrol, old tea, the brittle tang of metal. The shop is small in a neighborhood where people measure a man by how often his light is on at night. He calls to Mariam once and hears a breath on the other end, quiet, practiced. Their marriage has the slow bruise of endurance. Their daughter, Helen, sleeps with her head tucked under an old mosquito net. She will find a way to count the stars in the holes of the net when she wakes. Amanda had loved Jacob once, in the way that was reckless and bright, in the way that left her raw and vulnerable. She had also loved being above the fray, the way the city's loudness flattened out when she bought silence with money and control. The night she discovered the pregnancy, she did not know what it would cost her. She did not know that love and money could be manipulated by a sister who saw betrayal as currency. The hospital is a cool cathedral of white tiles and fluorescent light. There is an antiseptic smell that tries to sterilize more than bacteria, memory, guilt, decision. Dr. Admi's office has a kettle, a stack of forms, a watch that keeps running through bad choices. He tells himself he is helping the family that keeps his hospital alive. He tells himself the envelopes are for small favors that grease bearings. He slides papers across his desk as if the right signature will solve arithmetic he refuses to do. Amarka comes in with a calm, so practiced it could be taught. She carries herself like someone used to swallowing things whole. She hands an envelope to Dr. Admi while the nurses move between rooms. The envelope is thick enough to make him count the seconds. He looks at Amanda, pale, exhausted, yet still luminous, and thinks of his rent, of the school fees for his son. He takes the envelope. He takes the money. They move with the efficiency of people closing a deal. The midwives are busy. A nurse steps out to take the baby for routine checks. The corridor is empty enough for the small move to be unnoticed, noisy enough that footprints cannot be traced against the hum of fluorescent life. A nurse, hurried and distracted, carries the babies toward the nursery. Amarka follows at a distance that keeps her hands clean and her eyes precise. Amanda is handed a child who has not seen the world. Eyes closed, lashes fine as cotton. The baby's face is peaceful, a calm that buys the room a little grace. She cradles him and the room rearranges itself around her lightness. She sings nonsense syllables into his hair. She kisses the crown of his head and believes, for the first time in a long while, that someone needs her as much as she needs to be needed. Across the hallway, a healthy pink boy is bundled into a blanket and placed, for reasons Amanda cannot know, into the custody of a woman who signs the papers for St. Mary's Orphanage. The orphanage woman is kind enough, thin-handed, and ill-funded. She promises warmth she cannot always provide. The baby is placed into her arms because another set of hands decided it would be safer there than in the hands of a woman who seems to have everything and will probably keep everything. That night, Amanda brings Peter home. He does not react to light the way other babies do. His pupils do not search her face. The pediatrician shrugs at the margins. Some babies are slow to track. Some nose their way into sight over months. Amanda watches the room with a vigilante's hunger. She measures feedings, checks responses. The child sleeps. He breathes. Amanda hums in the hours that used to be for sleep. She names him Peter and gives him the house. Amid all of this, Jacob watches from the edges of his own life. Rumors travel down the lane. He hears that Amanda has given birth. He hears that she smiles in ways she never did before. He hears the name of a child he has not yet touched, a child that should be his. He threads that knowledge into days of work and nights of river-scented dreams. He leaves notes at the clinic, asks questions, is handed platitudes about hospital policy, about visiting hours. When his anger grows loud enough to steal sleep from him, he goes to the gate of the compound and watches the lights in the big house like a man counting candles in a cathedral. The swap is 2 minutes in anyone else's calendar. 2 minutes become a life. 6 years push through like a tide, pulling apart the coastlines these choices have made. The mansion blooms with expensive furniture and a different kind of quiet. Amanda pours herself into schedules and therapists. There are blindfolds made of silk for ceremonies. Therapists who teach Peter how to learn rooms by sound and smell. He learns the music of the house, the clink of spoons at breakfast, the hum of the refrigerator, the specific note Amanda hits when she counts him down for sleep. He learns language as someone learns a map by touch. He reaches for things without needing to see them. Peter is not objectified. He is a boy who feels with precision. He laughs with a throaty sound that makes Amanda cry some mornings, as if love has room for both joy and ache. Amanda builds the house into a guardian for this child. She fills rooms with textures, the soft velvet of cushions, the rough bark of a wooden toy carved in a workshop in another city, the scent of lemon oil on pine floors. She sings to him the lullabies she did not sing to herself. She tells him stories about a father who worked with his hands and who loved so fiercely he would make any old, crumpled promise and keep it. Across town, Philip grows into a different kind of resilience. St. Mary's is crowded, a building that keeps more secrets than it tells. The children are taught reverence and economy by the same people who have their own unpaid debts. Philip's hunger is not only for food, it is for light and for time. He reads the donated books with the kind of hunger that makes the words into a lamp. He learns quickly, pushes himself into mathematics like someone learning how to build a ladder. He is clever enough to be dangerous in a room that measures worth by what it can give. The matrons say he is bright, and yet brightness at St. Mary's means more notice and more neglect in equal measure. Mariam watches Jacob with a complicated tenderness. She loves him in pragmatic ways, in ways that have built their life from what little they have. The child in Amanda's arms is a question that sits between them, an open wound patched with silence. Mariam's face is a ledger of patience and fear. Patience for the days when food is on the table. Fear that the ghosts of the past will slither in and take the fragile good they have stitched together. She carries Helen on her hip and sometimes looks at Jacob with a look that is more plea than reproach. Amarka's life edges upward with each small betray. She buys a tinny television and a new pair of shoes for Chisholm, who learns to smile in a manner that looks like devotion. Chisholm's devotion is a performance. The cruelty beneath it is private and disguised as jokes. He sits in the living room of his mother's flat and tells stories that leave small children with raw places inside them. He visits the mansion often enough to keep the family comfortable with the illusion of connection, loyal relative, dutiful nephew. Amanda trusts appearances as much as she trusts the solidity of marble columns. But there are fissures. Amanda's businesses, once a triumphant tower, feel tremors. Contracts are delayed, partners become careful. Someone files a complaint against a subsidiary. Auditors begin asking for documents they never asked for before. The household shifts like a nervous animal. Money moves in ledgers with the same careful secrecy that brought Peter into her arms. Accounting is a language that can be reshaped by clenched fists in dark rooms. Jacob is followed once by a thin sedan that keeps a careful distance. He finds later a small device lodged beneath a toolbox lid, a GPS tracker no larger than a matchbox. He knows what it means. He does not know whose hand put it there. He is beaten one afternoon outside the garage, fists and boots sending him to the ground, while a voice says, "Keep away." The assailants are hired, faces blurred by the city. Helen hears her father cry and learns that adults can be broken like toys. Mariam covers Jacob's bruises with tea-cloths and does not ask questions she fears the answers to. Jacob thinks of the child in Amanda's pictures the way someone might think of a weather event, unstoppable and inevitable, but also ruinous. Meanwhile, Amarka keeps pocketing envelopes and making small phone calls. Dr. Admi visits her from time to time, leaves with stiff nods and the vague gait of a man who eats temptation like bread. Small transfers move from a shadow account to her hands. Cash is laundered through shell businesses. Chisholm helps with tasks that require muscle, a quick intimidation here, a message left by broken glass there. The family that smells of power shows teeth in the presence of those it considers lesser. Amanda, between board meetings and therapy sessions, begins to sense architecture under the chaos. Her accountant, a woman with gentle eyes and immaculate folders, calls her into a glass office that frames the city. There is a paper on the desk that catches the light. It is nothing dramatic at first, an old trustee statement from a decades-old trust Amanda's father had set up. The trust papers are the kind of thing that should have been dormant, a historical footnote in a family that likes to be tidy. But the accountant's finger lands on a faded reference, an entry that names a beneficiary with a surname Amanda has seen only once in a letter retrieved from a drawer. "This shouldn't be here," the accountant says, and watches Amanda blanch. The phrase is small, and yet it becomes the first crack in a wall. At the orphanage, Philip learns to keep his head down and his mind alight. He meets Emma, a thin girl whose cheekbones are too sharp for her years, and they trade little confidences behind a shed where the rain keeps secrets for them. Emma tells Philip about a sound she hears sometimes, voices in the night that are soft and mean. He tells her about numbers that make the world make sense for a little while. She laughs and says he would make a fine teacher. He thinks quietly that he would like to teach people to be kinder. Back in the mansion, the presence of Chisholm is like a petulant dog, loyal and dangerous. He brings flowers when he visits, pockets full of the minuscule threats he will use later. He tells jokes with too many teeth. He takes an interest in Peter's routine for reasons he never has to explain. Peter, who feels people rather than judges them by sight, senses the heat of Chisholm's hands and the way his laughter lingers like a bruise. Amanda, busy and tired, does not always notice these small shadows. One morning, in a room lined with file boxes, a woman from an auditing firm pulls out a folder labeled Atlas Trust, Indefinido. The trust is older than the current generation. It smells of a time when name and lineage were claims a bank could hold. The auditor flips pages. Her brow knits. There is a notation, small, penciled, almost apologetic, that a dormant account, a beneficiary clause, and a name matching Jacob's mother's maiden name were recorded near the time Amanda's father made a will. There is a transfer, indirect and obfuscated, that does not make sense in the current ledger. Amanda reads the scrawl and feels the room tilt. The house hums around her like a head full of bees. She thinks of the baby she held 6 years ago and feels anger like a weight in her chest. She thinks of a man who works with his hands and feels pity, and something that is not yet nameable. Fear that the neatness of her life might not have been entirely bought, but also that someone else has been left with the cost. Jacob hears about the beating and the tracker through whispers at the garage. He knows the city runs on reputations and threats. He begins to expect that any knock on the door could be the man who will bring violence next. He thinks about walking to the orchard near the river with Helen, about teaching her to change a tire, about showing her how to keep her hands steady against the weight of life. He freezes when neighbors speak the mansion's name as if it were a thundercloud. Mariam's patience thins to a thread. She confronts Jacob once in a kitchen where the kettle is always near boiling, and her voice is small and hot. "If you go near that house, do not come back." Jacob breathes in, the joke of his life coiled into a hard truth. He wants to tell her everything, about the night he and Amanda had thought the future would be different, about how he had hoped for a life that did not begin in shame. But the words catch on the thinness of bread. Amarka watches all of this like a cat watching birds. She arranges her days to be present enough to be useful, distant enough to be safe. She keeps a ledger of small justifications. When Jacob is beaten, she hears the news from a neighbor and allows her face to rearrange itself into an expression of startled concern. When auditors come in, she slips away to make calls. She pays people for silence in ways she has learned to justify. An investment, a protection. Loyalty, in her mind, is a currency she spends for survival. The first small legal notices arrive like winter. Amanda's accountant suggests revisiting some hospital receipts, dates, signatures, records that could be reconciled if the ledger were honest. Amanda's hands tremble at the thought. She had trusted a hospital because its name carried polish and because Dr. Admi had smiles that were meant to reassure. She sends a polite request for records. The reply is bureaucratic and slow, a thin, legalese-scented buffer. She is used to moving things fast. The ledger moves slower. Philip teaches himself Latin phrases from an old prayer book donated to the orphanage. The words make him feel like he is standing in a library and not a room with cracked paint. He learns to fold his thoughts into a smaller, sharper place and keeps a folded paper with numbers that he calls puzzles. He is bright enough to make a small teacher of himself, a life hacked into order with grit. One evening, a young accountant in Amanda's team, who has been tracing oddities in the family's financial web, finds the notation that will not sit still. A trustee's letter, aged and stained, refers to a contingency. Should the primary line fail, distribute holdings to the collateral named Okorombadi family, indefinido. The paper is polite and unrevealing, but the name is enough. There is a chain of transactions on a ledger that moves money into an inactive beneficiary pool, and then out into a maintenance fund that lists a city district where Jacob's family is known to live. This might be nothing, the accountant says, voice flat with the possible enormity of small things. Amanda looks at the page and the name and tastes an old grief like metal. She does not allow herself to hope. Hope is an expensive thing. Jacob, thinking of the tracker now as an omen, goes quiet when Chisholm appears at a church fundraiser, with a smile that makes old ladies forget to breathe. Chisholm lingers and asks casually about the garage's busiest hours, about who owes what, about habits. He leaves a business card that flexes like a knife in Jacob's pocket. Jacob puts the card in a small box where he keeps his tools' receipts, and finds one day that the card had moved. Some hands had rummaged through his affairs and left it. Amarka sends messages to Dr. Admi in a code learned by people who have to erase fingerprints. He answers in the thin language of necessity. He tells her that certain papers have been moved into storage, and that the orphanage has been paid for services rendered. They speak like two people reconciling morality with survival. Amanda calls the hospital and asks for further records. The clerk replies that some papers are in transit. The voice at the other end is polite, cautious. A small voice in Amanda's mind says, "Ask for camera footage." The thought is dangerous, almost audacious. Hospitals keep nursery logs for a time. They keep footage in a system guarded by policy and privacy. Amanda knows that asking for CCTV is the equivalent of pressing on a bruise. In the small hours, when the mansion is quiet and Peter sleeps with his face open toward the moonlight slanting through the curtains, Amanda sits with the trustee letter and the ledger page. She reads lines aloud that mean nothing, and then, when the house offers only the sound of the fridge, she imagines a map that joins two lives, Jacob's and her own. The name on the ledger is brittle with distance. Not the name she remembers, but a branching name. A compound that suggests a marriage or a liaison in a generation that predates her. She thinks of genealogy like a secret river that sometimes rips its bank and floods. She thinks of fairness and what it might look like if the river chooses where to run. Jacob, after the beating, after the tracker, sits on a curb and counts his fingers as if they were beads. He thinks of the way Amanda had looked at him when she believed they would get through things together. He thinks of the child he will never publicly claim, the child that haunts him in the sound of laughter from the mansion. He thinks of Helen, who will one day need to choose between being small to belong and being loud to survive. He decides, in the way people decide when they have nothing left to choose, to go to the hospital and ask once more. He plans a casualness that will be hard to sustain. The accountant in Amanda's office pulls a file labeled Hospital Indefinido and adds a sticky note. She writes, in a neat hand, Request CCTV, Nursery Wing, Query transfers linked to Okorum Body. She slides the note into a folder marked Urgent and calls a colleague who knows someone at the hospital. Amarka hears of the audit through channels she has paid for, like the way a woman hears the creak of a neighbor's front gate when rain is near. She tightens her jaw. She makes plans not to be found unready. She sends Chisholm out to smooth a path with a smile that means nothing. When Jacob arrives at the hospital, he is small under the bland canopy of its roof. He asks at the reception with a humility that is the only thing he has learned to export. The clerk looks at him with the pleasant condescension of someone who has never had to choose between a meal and a schoolbook. Jacob's name finds no reference. The records clerk suggests he fill out a form for historical inquiries. Jacob writes with a hand that shakes. The form is a thin piece of bureaucracy. He folds it like prayer and hands it in. Amanda, in her office, looks at the trustee's notation and loops in a lawyer with hands that know how to find papers people would rather keep hidden. The lawyer's call is efficient. He asks quietly whether she wants a discreet inquiry or a public one. She wants both. She wants the truth. She wants the child she bore, the child she cradled and loved, to be acknowledged, but not at the cost of destroying a life that has learned to survive in different conditions. At night, in his bed, Philip dreams of a house he cannot name. It is both big and small. It smells of lemon oil and warm milk. He tucks his paper puzzles under his pillow like offering. He has the sensation sometimes of being looked at by someone who has not yet seen him clearly. He thinks, without knowing why, that there is a thread somewhere that will pull him into light. The city moves around these lives with the indifference of weather. A ledger can hide or reveal. A GPS tracker can be a threat or a warning. Small transactions, an inactive beneficiary adjustment, a faded trustee note, become pieces of evidence or pieces of argument, depending on who finds them and what they decide to do. Amanda walks the corridors of her house with a sheet of paper and the feeling of something thin and fragile between her ribs. She thinks of the small boys she loves in different ways. She thinks of the legacy her father left, wealth as scaffolding, wealth as liability. The ledger page, when she folds it and presses it close to her heart, feels like the first clear thing she has had in months. A clue. Jacob sits with a cup of tea that has gone cold and remembers a night he spent with Amanda in a car, with the radio turned low. The memory is bright and sharp. He thinks of promises, of a child with brown limbs he has never washed, of a small hand that might have been his. He feels, for the first time in a long while, the urge to do something that might be reckless and right. Amarka hears a phone ring and answers it like a woman who has rehearsed for calamity. On the other end, a voice that counts money in a polite tone tells her that some papers have been flagged and that there is a young woman with an auditor on the line. She breathes in, tastes steel, and tells them to be calm. There is nothing to fear, she says, because everything has been accounted for. But accounts do not always tell the whole truth. They tell the parts that have fingerprints and signatures. There are notes that are written in pencil and washed away by rain. When the accountant vocalizes the 3 words that have been sitting cold in a folder, "This transaction shouldn't be here," the room seemed to drop an invisible temperature. Amanda hears the note like a call to arms. She asks for more. She asks for the trustee's letter to be scanned, for the ledger trail to be followed. She sits with Peter, the way a person clutches a life raft. She strokes his hair and decides, with the decisiveness of someone who has rebuilt companies from debt, to pursue the paper trail. As night gathers, Jacob folds his hands until his knuckles whiten and thinks of the man at the hospital who pointed at him with dismissive eyes. He thinks of the tracker found in the toolbox and wonders who pays for fear to be a constant. He will go to the compound again. He will not be a trespasser in his memories. His steps when he walks are softer now, practiced. Elsewhere, a small financial firm emails a scanned page, an auditor's note with a reference that ties an inactive beneficiary to a family name that Jonah would have heard in lullabies. The email subject line reads like an omen: Trust Review, Atlas Trust, Indefinido. Amanda opens it and finds a series of names, some familiar, some not, scribbled in a hand that might be older than any living memory. The name Jacob recognizes, his mother's name, appears among them. The chain is frayed, but it exists. She feels suddenly as though a window that had been boarded up is leaning backward. Questions press at her. The house hums with the sound of an engine idling, a persistent murmur. She thinks of the child she sleeps beside and feels the small, hot blade of fear and love. Outside, the city continues its indifferent routines, but inside a handful of rooms, the air is thinner. Small decisions unfold into bigger moves. Someone will request CCTV. Someone will tell the hospital to look for files. Someone will call the orphanage and ask for names. Someone will perhaps retrieve grainy footage that will show 2 minutes, 2 changed lives. But for now, the city holds its breath with them. If twists like this grip you, subscribe to follow Amanda's story. The afternoon after the accountant's discovery, a courier arrives with a sealed envelope from a trustee, listed only as Atlas Trust, Indefinido. The envelope contains a photocopy of a letter, browned at the edges. On the top, a faint watermark nods to a time when paper could keep secrets with dignity. The wording is hedged in legalese, but incisive enough to be dangerous. A contingent beneficiary clause that name-checks a collateral line, and a footnote that a maintenance allocation was directed to a local representative on a date that matches a period when a young man, now called Jacob, could have been connected to the family. Amanda lays the paper on her desk and listens to the quiet. For the first time since Peter was placed in her arms, she thinks of DNA as less a solution than a map. The ledger suggests a tie that is not merely biological, but also financial. A line of favor or obligation that reaches back perhaps 1 generation further than anyone in her immediate family is willing to speak about. Jacob hears, through someone at the garage who knows someone at the clinic, that an auditor has flagged a trust. It sounds like the city announcing rain. He cannot read the papers, but he feels the air change, like the static before a storm. In the house, Amanda rings the lawyer and asks for hospital records with a focus that does not allow for delay. She asks the lawyer to make a discreet request for nursery footage. The lawyer, trained in the calculus of reputations, offers caution. Amanda presses until he agrees to ask for custody and surveillance logs. She thinks of the camera angles, and of a nurse who might have been hurried enough to sign the wrong name under the wrong date. At the orphanage, a young woman named Ruth sorts clothes and keeps the children in line. She is a woman who would otherwise escape notice, but who has time enough to notice a boy whose eyes are too clever for his food. When a letter arrives from a lawyer asking for temporary access to records, she looks at the name and feels a pull she cannot quite describe, an unease like a child's doubt. She closes the file carefully, palms warm from carrying too many small bodies, and places it in a drawer with the proper respect a person gives to things that could change lives. Amarka sits back in her chair, counting not cash today, but calculations. She has spent years building an argument around survival. The trust's notation could be a hole through which all her careful work leaks. She calls Chisholm and hears the young man's practiced laugh. She tells him to be patient, to be calm. She arranges for small bribes to be delivered, legal fees in envelopes, tidy sums that could be explained as donations. She does not yet see a route that allows her to undo everything. She sees only individual steps that keep her afloat. Outside the mansion, the city is indifferent. A boy sells roasted yam at a corner. An elderly man nags his goats. The world keeps minor things moving, while the manes of several lives tremble. Within the walls of those lives, a ledger, a smear of ink, a mistranscribed name will set in motion an unraveling that no one in a comfortable house wants. The ledger is a silent animal now pacing in the dark. Amanda presses her forehead to the cool glass of the office window and thinks of trust like a word you inherit with a name. The paper on the desk becomes a promise and a threat at once. She will follow the money, if that is what it takes to find the truth about a child she has loved and believed was hers. She will also need to hold the other child, the blind boy whose small hand curls around hers at night. Her heart is not all strategy. It swells and contracts like the tide. Jacob, the next day, packs a small bag for Helen with extra biscuits and a faint hope. He will go to the orphanage to ask for a list of children born on the day he remembers, to fill out forms, and to be told politely that such things require procedures. He will spend his presence like a coin, hoping someone will accept it. Later that week, the lawyer's assistant calls with a tentative line. The hospital has custody of some old tapes and a head nurse who remembers the day as one of confusion. She asks if Amanda wants a formal request for historical footage. Amanda says yes. Her voice, when she says it, is small and steady. Whatever the ledger promises, she will see the past unspool in black and white frames if she must. Philip counts his puzzles under a bed. He senses the city rearranging itself, even if he does not know how. He plays with a wooden toy truck and makes the wheels go in a line that is the closest thing he has to a map. He thinks that somewhere the world bends toward him. He hopes for the monstrous grace of being claimed. The first part of the investigation has begun. Files are summoned, letters scanned. A trustee's faded pen stroke is being chased down by bright modern hands. Cameras may reveal what papers hide. A transaction that once read like a small ghost in a ledger is now flesh and breath. It connects, in ink, two families who thought themselves separated by more than money. The account has become a hinge. It will, if followed, swing doors open. At the orphanage, Ruth looks at a boy's name and pauses. She sets a gentle hand on his shoulder and, for reasons she cannot explain, takes his hand to feel the smallness of it. She has the sudden conviction that some children are placed with her hand because the world needs to hide them. She will not keep them hidden if someone with a right to know comes seeking. For now, the house waits and the ledger cools under Amanda's fingers. The account is an idea that could mend or maim. It could explain tenderness or greed, ancestral ties or insurance policies. It is not proof. It is a trail. Outside, Jacob walks toward the hospital with work-soiled palms and a heart that will not stop asking for something he cannot name. He reaches the gate, and for a moment he thinks of turning back and staying in the neat lines of his life. Then he moves forward. The city closes in around these decisions like an audience around a stage. People take their seats, some out of curiosity, some because the script of their lives depends on the outcome. Two small boys sleep under different roofs, each carrying inside the ache of an absent history. Two women hold manuscripts of possible truth. One account, tucked away and labeled in careful script, begins to thrum. The ledger sits like a small, dangerous promise on Amanda's desk. The paper has a life now. It will lead to inquiries, to footage requests, to conversations in rooms where the air tastes like metal and fear. The first collated piece has been uncovered, and it connects a poor mechanic to a family of means, in a way no photograph ever could. It is not proof of everything, but it is a doorway. Amanda locks the file into a drawer and walks to the nursery where Peter hums in sleep. She bends over him and kisses the place a father's hand would find, then steps back and listens to the sleeping house. She is tired, but she is moving. The ledger has given her a direction. Jacob stands outside a window and looks at the mansion as if it were a foreign country. He thinks of what reclaiming would mean: shame, danger, a life unraveled, and chooses, quietly, to keep going. He thinks of Helen learning to count bolts in the garage, and of what it would look like if the future could be changed. In another room, Amarka closes her ledger and slides on a coat. She will make a few calls and leave things tidy for others to find. She will prepare the stories she needs later. The city hums. The pieces move. A secret bank account has begun to feel less secret. It links, by ink and by hint, a poor mechanic to the bloodline of a billionaire. It is fragile but substantial, enough to justify a reopened investigation, enough to make a nurse replay a memory, enough to make an accountant say aloud, with the gravity of someone who has held fragile things, "This transaction shouldn't be here." What would you do if you discovered a secret like the bank account? Comment below. The copy of the trustee letter lay on Amanda's desk like a small accusation. Outside, rain smeared the city into watercolors. Inside, the house kept its temperature as if nothing could find purchase there. She read the faded scrawl again, as if new lines might appear with repeated attention. The words did not change. What did change was the way she understood the world built around her. How much of it had been the careful architecture of choices she had never made. Her lawyer arrived with the quiet efficiency of someone practiced in disentangling private disasters. They spoke in a glass room without drama. The words were precise. Request footage, subpoena documents, preserve chain of custody. He advised caution. Legal red tape could be turned into an alibi by people who knew how to thread a needle through a storm. Amanda listened and felt grief and fury braided into something that tasted like power. Jacob kept moving, because movement was what consumed his days. He had gone to the orphanage with a small, polite request and left with a name written on a scrap of paper. Ruth, kind and practical, had looked at him the way a woman looks at a person who might be about to break. She had not given him guarantees, but she had given him something else. A time and a promise to be present when the lawyer came. He had taken those words like a kind of water and kept them in the pocket of his jacket. The hospital complied slowly, and then all at once. A clerk who understood the risk of being honest slid a compact disc, an old-fashioned master copy, into an envelope and left it on the lawyer's desk with a note. They keep a backup off-site. We'll need a warrant if they resist. The lawyer smiled, the kind of smile that understood the pressures of institutions. He did not need a warrant. He had a solicitor's letter and a brief that suggested reputational danger. The hospital administrator who took the call had a choice and chose the easier route. But choices have counters. The word of the inquiry leaked, perhaps in the polite circle of hospital staff, perhaps via someone paid to listen. Amarka heard the news as a cold wind finds cracks. She moved with the same measured calm she had used to make other decisions. Phone calls in the night, envelopes prepared, chickens slaughtered for attention. She called Chisholm and told him the house was being prodded. He laughed in the way men laugh when they are not yet forced to carry consequences. "Keep to the plan," she said. "If anyone asks, say you dropped by to see the child, nothing more." Chisholm read abundance as entitlement. He had watched the big house swap its moods with the seasons and had learned which curtains to draw and which to leave open. He had also learned to use his size as if it were an argument. Now, with the prospect of footage, he felt a new irritation, an impatience quickened by fear. He hired men to shadow the lawyer's assistant. He left notes on their van that looked like the casual trash of a city. He did not care if his hands were visible, so long as the tracks he left led somewhere plausible. There is an ugly economy to cowardice. It spends money on people without names and pays them in threats. Jacob found a man lying in the orchard one morning, shaken and silent. The man had been told to watch the house and to report if anyone moved too freely. He had been paid and then slapped with a warning that broke him. He gave Jacob a detail, one small, stupid thing that marked the men who had followed Jacob before. A tattoo of a compass, half scrubbed as though the owner already expected to lose it. Jacob carried that image like a stone in his pocket. The footage arrived in a sealed envelope and a lawyer's file stamped with permission. Amanda sat with the disc in her hands, the way a woman might hold a match to understand a darker world. The lawyer set up a room small enough to look immune to drama. The screen glowed grainy and imperfect, the way memory is imperfect when it is turned into images. They watched. The nursery was a hive of movement. Nursery staff who knew the routine, babies bundled and returned to mothers, the banal choreography of birth wards. But there in the frame, the choreography was crooked. A doctor, neat hair, a face that had once seemed kindly, took an envelope and tucked it into his coat. A woman with a flat face passed close by, Amarka, moving with the deliberateness of someone practicing a piece. The nurse carrying the healthy pink boy moved through a door that led the opposite way to the route Amanda had believed. A hand, someone's small, practical hand, shifted the baby into the arms of a woman who signed for St. Mary's. The clip held 2 minutes. 2 minutes were enough. Amanda felt something in her chest unpick itself. It was not relief, so much as recognition that a life had been stolen with polite hands. She watched the nurse's face, the way she hesitated almost imperceptibly when Amarka's hand brushed the envelope the doctor accepted. The grainy footage offered the kind of objectivity that polished speeches cannot touch, motion and presence. The doctor, Dr. Admi, looked like a man who expected forgiveness. They did not show the footage to anyone else. The lawyer insisted on a careful circle. Evidence had to be handled like a fragile vessel. Hasty exposure might ruin the chance to hold people accountable. But secrets are communal things. Someone within the administration could not help but tell the obstetric head that this will ruin reputations. That phrase spread like an aroma into ears that had known how to move money. Chisholm did not wait for the law to move. He sent a man to the archives where an elderly technician kept tapes and memories. The technician had been there long enough to know the quiet ways of survival. Friends stop by, people need favors, sons come home to ask for jobs. A man with a heavy coat and an even heavier silence offered him the convenience of a bribe and the threat of a trouble that carried a promise. Empty your shelves for us, or you will regret it. The technician, who had children and a mortgage, took the envelope. He told no one. He stayed awake a long time thinking of the image of his boy at a field on a Sunday. But Amanda's lawyer had not been idle. He had quietly mirrored the request, copied the footage the moment the disk arrived and transferred it to an off-site secure server. When the technician's safe was forced, when the van with men arrived and smashed into lockers, the lawyer had already taken the proof away. The men left grumbling and with less than they had hoped. They had expected an easy vandalism. They had found only a locked cupboard where nothing of consequence remained. That night, in a compound office that smelled of printer toner and late coffee, the lawyer watched the same footage and felt the complexity of law. He called the officer from the economic crimes unit he had been taught to trust. The officer arrived in the small hours with the kind of tired eyes that know what it is to see life reduced to transaction. They spoke for a long while about chain of custody and parallel investigations. The officer's voice was steady. "We will move tonight," he said. "We have enough here to detain for questioning." The arrest was not a spectacle performed for cameras. It was practical, abrupt as a snapped thread. Men in plain clothes arrived at Amarka's flat while she sat counting notes, for habit more than profit, watching a soap operatic in the corner of her life. She had a look of someone who had spent a lifetime believing that small briberies were a shield because they bought you a margin of safety. The men asked her to stand. She did not resist with force. She resisted with words, a litany of disbelief. Amanda was not present for the initial cuffing. She watched, instead, from the library window, as a car took Amarka away with a compacted denial that was half performance and half bone. Chisholm had been picked up in a rented van while he sat at a mechanic's workshop, hands dirty with the kind of grease that never cleanseth a person of other sins. He had tried to move like a man who might flee. But there are routes one cannot run if you are famous for violence. He met the officers with a blank face that did not make him smaller. Dr. Admi, however, had a different plan. He attempted to erase traces, files from a computer, a nurse's ledger, a doctor's written notes. But the hospital's digital system was not his to control. The administrator had already sent encrypted copies to the solicitor. The soft hum of data replication can be a whistle to those who have done wrong. You cannot erase what has been scattered. He was stopped at his gate by officers who had watched the footage with a patience that was no longer incidental. He had a watch that still ticked through poor choices and a pale envelope in his pocket, where once there had been the idea that money could be a solution. Even as the cars took them, small menacing figures tried to negotiate. A man who claimed to be a cousin of the detained, a friend who had once known a well-placed person, an intermediary who asked for leniency in language that sounded like bargaining. The officers met them with the decorum of those who understand the shape of corruption. Evidence was being collected, but the officer on the case warned Amanda in a voice that did not attempt optimism. Arrests are not verdicts. They were a beginning. The orphanage was notified. It was a place where routine measured days, and where the arrival of a well-dressed woman with a lawyer was an event that cleared the corridors. Amanda walked, not as a storm, but as someone who had learned to command rooms without shouting. Ruth met her, hands dusted from laundry work, and led her to the small play area where children napped in rows like awkward little vows. Phililip was a thinness of will wrapped in a child's frame, alert to sound, watchful, used to corners. Amanda saw him and felt the immediate, irrational ache of motherhood. He sat with a posture that had learned to keep himself tidy because the world demanded it. She knelt and spoke a name he did not yet recognize. He looked up with a guarded openness reserved for children. Then, in the way that children have of owning moments, he reached for a toy truck, an old wooden thing, and turned it over in his hands with a care that made Amanda think of Jacob's fingers. In that single motion, she saw something like inheritance. Not in money, but in small mannerisms, a tilt to the wrist that echoed a man who fixed engines. Her eyes filled, and she swallowed air as if it were a foreign thing. They did not rush into an embrace. Social workers, protective orders, protocols, each demanded time and care. Amanda spoke softly and promised, without overpromising to be gentle. Philip allowed a hand to be held. His small, expert fingers found Amanda's thumb and closed around it, a brief contract of 2 lives. Jacob watched from a distance as Amanda placed a tentative hand on the boy's shoulder. He felt an odd mix of fury and gratitude. His hands, which had never once been permitted to be steady in such rooms, trembled nonetheless. He did not cross that threshold immediately. Mariam stood a step behind him, like a shadow with a face. Helen, older now in ways sadder than her years, pressed herself against her mother's arm and looked as if she were trying to see what would be left. The DNA tests moved with the precise indignity of science. Swabs, sealed envelopes, a laboratory with white coats that made things official, because that was the language of what the past had been made from. Amanda watched the samples go as if the movement of sealed tubes were the forwarding of a verdict. Jacob's hands were still. He kept thinking of the day he had stood outside the mansion gate and counted lights like candles in a cathedral. He thought of the child who might be his, and wanted to weep with a relief he feared to name. When the results came, they came with a simplicity that made the world rearrange its furniture. The match was not a drama on paper. It was a fact, dry and crystalline. Philip's DNA matched Jacob's. The lab's notation was a string of numbers and letters. It was the kind of object that robs conversations of comfortable evasions. Amanda read the letter on a bench outside the hospital and felt something under her ribs shift from suspicion to a new reality. She had her son, and he had a father she had not seen in 6 years, except in fragments. There was a small ceremonial conclusion to the discovery. Officers took statements. Signatures were made, hands placed on forms. The law was beginning to move like a heavy and considerate animal. It would take time to sort accountability and to issue charges that would stand scrutiny. But for that afternoon, there was a simpler thing to do. To set 2 children in the same room with a woman who now believed they were both hers to love. Amanda held Philip with an awkward tenderness that was new to them both. The boy's shoulders were stiff with an education in self-protection. He did not immediately melt into the role of son, because no child who has known neglect can slide instantly into intimacy. He allowed the contact for a span, and then, when he felt it safe, he leaned his head against Amanda's chest and closed his eyes like a man who had finally been permitted to rest. Peter, who had been brought to meet his half-brother under Amanda's careful direction, sat on the floor and listened. He reached for Philip and touched the small wrist as if checking for pulse. His gesture was half curiosity, half welcome. He was not a plot. He was a boy with a complex new geography to learn. Jacob stood with his hands in his pockets and let the moment happen around him. He had dreamed of this moment not as a tidy reconciliation, but as an unpicking of a knot. He and Amanda exchanged a look full of a language they had once spoken. There was no melodrama, only the quiet, bewildered recognition of 2 people who had been wronged in different ways. Amanda's face softened with a grief that began to include wonder. Jacob's expression was lulled into cautious gratitude. Outside, the arrests and the evidence were catalogued. Amarka's flat was searched, and small envelopes were found, neat stacks with ledger notes that did not deny their uses. There were receipts. There were also items that made the investigator tilt his head. A scanned copy of a trustee's correspondence, a note that matched the handwriting of the aged letter Amanda had been given. The pattern was not yet coherent, but it pointed to something legally equivalent to a whisper. Funds had flowed on dates that coincided with events no one wanted to link publicly. Transfers had names attached, names that read like family branches. Okoro Mbadi, Okoro Collateral Line, marked with codes and a shorthand legible only to those who traded in secrecy. Where money moves, motives are rarely simple. The forensic accountant Amanda's team brought in spent a long week with ledgers, with bank printouts labeled indefinido, with trustee notes that read like calls for discretion. He found sequences, small allocations made to an agent indefinido on dates that matched the hospital's dramatic events. There were also payments to an individual with an address in another country, a string of transfers that suggested an intermediary network. The accountant's report was careful. He did not claim to have identified every hand involved. He did not draw arrows that connected persons to motives. He instead placed queries in columns. Where did the money originate? Who benefited directly? Were payments documented to legitimate services, or were they purposely obscured in maintenance accounts? Amanda stared at those columns long after the accountant had left. The truth she had wished for was partial. The bank account had unlocked a chain of custody and supplied an explanation of sorts. But it also whispered of a wider architecture. The transfers could be interpreted one way: greed, a sister who sold moral currency for comfort, or another, someone in the family or connected to the family who wanted a collateral descendant recognized for reasons beyond simple pocketing. A clause in the trustee's letter, the one about distributing funds to a collateral line if the primary line failed, had leapt from paper to possibility. What had that clause meant in practice? Had it been mere insurance, a legal backup, or an instruction that someone had decided to operationalize? The accountant marked indefinido beside a name. His neutrality was the kind of honesty Amanda needed. There were more discoveries that complicated motives. Among Amarka's papers, investigators found a letter dating back decades. An old folded note with a signature Amanda recognized. Her father's private counsel, a man who had arranged the trust and who had been dead for some years. The letter referenced a hidden contingency. If the direct line did not produce heirs, the trustee should consider supporting primary collateral nominees. The phrasing was polite. The implication was devastating. Someone might have read the contingency as an opportunity. But the presence of that contingency did not explain the human choices that had been made. It did not reduce Amarka's act to policy. It did not make the hurt any smaller. It only added a new layer, a financial instrument that could be read by a cunning person as a justification for an otherwise immoral act. The temptation to view the clause as motive was strong, yet Amanda's chest remained full of immediate facts. 2 children, one of whom was her blood. She had to hold them both. Police caution prevented public pronouncements about the ultimate intent behind the transfers. Officers cautioned Amanda and the press to remember that investigations could lead in many directions. They arrested Amarka and charged her with conspiracy to commit child trafficking and related counts, but they would not say whether Amarka had acted alone or whether she had been guided by letters and funds that made her cruel act possible. Jacob, amid all of this legal choreography, found something else. A small, battered photograph that had been folded into Amarka's wallet. It showed, decades earlier, 2 women by a river, one elegant in a way older clothes make elegance bearable, another in a simple dress with a child between them. On the back, someone had written a name and a date. The handwriting was Amarka's. Jacob took the photograph in a small, trembling hand, and did not know whether to feel vindicated or hollowed. He kept the photograph because it was a reminder that the motives human beings give themselves are often knitted from small, secretive memories. Mariam watched these movements with an exhausted detachment. She had always measured affection in practicalities. She watched Jacob with the same watchful eye she used to track the kettle on the stove. She had not expected redemption to look like a lawyer's clearance or a police statement. She had expected survival. Now survival asked for different measures. The presence of a son who had been wronged. The possibility that her family would have to meet a public scrutiny it had not been prepared for. She sat in the back of the hospital room one afternoon with Helen on her lap and listened as Amanda and Jacob discussed childcare arrangements as practicalities rather than declarations. Their conversation was jarringly ordinary. Who would pay for school? Who would attend the first parent-teacher meeting? It was the kind of talk that mends, or at least learns, how to fold the edges. Peter, who had been the first child Amanda had been given, watched the adults with a kind of steady curiosity to which children are uniquely entitled. He noticed small things, the way Jacob's hands smelled like grease, the way Phililip's laugh had a half-pause that his father tended to make when he was fixing an engine. He asked Amanda, in the simple way children ask, whether Phililip could come to a story night. His question was not political. It was human. Amanda said yes. News of the arrests leaked to the press in the way large things seep into the margins of daily life. Reporters called Amanda's office and left polite voicemails. She let a few calls pass and answered none. The photographer who took a careful picture for a morning paper captured Amanda looking a certain way. Composed, tired, dignified. The image traveled for a day, and then folded into other news. But that public interest was another layer for the family to navigate. It was yet another reason for discretion. The ledger still throbbed like an echo. The forensic accountant sent through a preliminary report that suggested the money had flowed through an offshore mechanism to an agent who paid for placement services. The phrase made Amanda feel sick because its bureaucratic coldness belied the child in her arms. The accountant highlighted a name, an obscure trust manager registered in a country that made simple inquiries expensive and slow. He added a caveat. Where such structures exist, they often sit like a protective shell. They protect sometimes, and sometimes they hide. Amanda did what she could. She put both boys in her life, and she stepped back into her duties with a newfound purpose that did not feel like business as usual. She sent her best people to manage Phililip's immediate needs at school and to find tutors. She also instructed the household to maintain Peter's routines. He had already lost a stability that belonged to him, and she would not be the cause of further disorientation. That meant balancing two truths, biological fact and caregiving reality. It meant making choices that would not make headlines, but would anchor small lives. Jacob volunteered to help in practical ways. He taught Phililip about small mechanical things, about the way a screwdriver could be an introduction to practical problem-solving. The boy listened to him, with a hunger his orphanage had rarely permitted to be satisfied. Jacob's respect for the child was gentle, earned and returned. There was no simple redemption, but there was a quiet construction of rights and days. Within the legal paperwork, an investigator found something that tightened the air. A trustee's email chain that had once been archived under indefinido, but which contained a notation, allocate maintenance to Okoro Mbadi collateral line on verification of descendants, confidential, indefinido. The email's author was an old name, a person who had for years been a behind-the-scenes advisor to the family. Whether the notation had been an abstract precaution or a trigger for action was a question that would live in courtrooms and boardrooms. In the present, it was only a question to be carried like a seed. Amanda sat with that line and imagined the possibilities it proffered. Had a small clause in an old trust encouraged someone to move beyond moral confines and into transactional cruelty? If that were true, then the ledger was not only a path to her son's return, but also a map to a kind of moral bankruptcy that reached further than one woman. The thought did not vindicate Amarka's acts. It complicated the blame by adding more hands and more shadows. Chisholm, locked in a cell that had less light than he had thought his life would ever know, watched television news from a corner. He was furious and baffled. He had always thought threats were enough. The arrest's shadow forced him to consider alternatives he had not counted. A future where he would be called to account, where his jokes and his cruelty would be recorded as part of a legal narrative. He sent a letter to Amanda, an attempt at contrition that read like a child testing for applause. Amanda let it sit unanswered. There was nothing she could do in a mere note. Amarka, in custody, was differently composed. She had rehearsals for many things, but not for the small exposure of notes in handwriting she had thought private. She claimed necessity, then later, alone in an interview room, She claimed a different shape of motive. Misread obligation, a sense of having been sidelined, a willingness to do something terrible for the sake of a family she believed had never wanted her. She did not, in those quiet moments, make herself smaller. She made herself human in ways that did not excuse, but that demanded a certain disquieting empathy from those who listened. When the initial hearings were scheduled, the air in courtrooms smelled of paper and new suits. Lawyers argued not only facts, but the kind of language that will determine who gets to speak in public. Amanda watched the processes through briefed summaries. The law moved dutifully, slowly. It made definitive things feel like negotiations. It was not an immediate arc of justice. It was procedural bankwork, masked by ritual. The public would see arrests and a trial. The private world would continue to stitch itself in quieter cloth. At home, nights were sometimes unbearable for Amanda. She would lie awake and map in her head the timeline of decisions. Her father's trust, the small notes tucked into envelopes, the nurse who had been hurried and distracted. She would press her palm to Peter's sleeping head and think of Philip across town. The ledger was a map, yes, but maps do not always show intentions, they show routes. Then, on an afternoon when rain had given way to a strange, sparse sunlight, a package arrived at Amanda's office. It had been forwarded from a lawyer in a foreign city, stamped with bureaucratic indifference and the weight of distance. Inside was a single document, a trustee's memorandum, marked in a hand careful enough to be archival. It reiterated the contingency clause. But beneath the official lettering was a notated line in pencil. Call when confirmed. Consult with Agent Indefinido. There was also an attached scanned note, an instruction that signaled not just a passive contingency, but active oversight. A named agent was to ensure placement of collateral nominees in such a manner as to preserve family continuity. Indefinido. The language had the smell of old men making plans they thought would be civilized, of arrangements made for lineage that made the rest of the world into a calculus. Amanda read the words and felt the room tilt again. Someone had given a private letter the power to be a justification. The paper itself was not a crime. It was the human translation that made it dangerous. Someone, somewhere, had read a clause meant for contingency as a plan. She called the officer on her case. "This makes it look like an instruction," she said quietly. "It makes me think there are others who thought this was legitimate." The officer was measured. "It suggests people may have read it that way. It doesn't prove they acted on it. But it is a line worth following. We will. We have investigators skilled in following places where money hides." There was relief in that, a kind of relief that is not at all restful. They followed accountants and emails, and a man who handled offshore trusts like an archivist handles old letters, carefully and with an eye for the phrase that hides meaning. Each new name they saw was a door that might open or might lead only to more shadows. The investigator wrote indefinido in many margins. It was a cautionary word that acknowledged not knowing. As the days unfurled, Philip began to understand that his world had changed. He was enrolled in a small school where the principal gave him extra time and where the other children accepted him without malice. He learned to count in a classroom with better supplies than his fomented childhood had known. But he also learned an older lesson that would take years to unlearn, that adults do not always keep their promises. There were nights when he woke and listened for the city outside and wondered whether he, who had been moved like a small object, would ever be thought of as whole. Peter adapted in his own measured way. He learned the rhythms of a life that included a new boy with a soft, guarded smile. He asked questions with a child's curiosity. "Why does Philip look at me when I sing?" And Amanda answered with the kind of honesty that did not elaborate beyond what he could hold. She told him the truth as far as he needed that day and no more. She took him to a teacher who taught children how to chart rooms with sound, a woman who spoke the world in maps of echoes. Peter learnt routes through a house like a cartographer, learning a brave land. The bank account trail continued to offer hints. The lawyer found a name, an intermediary, who had recently been declared bankrupt in another jurisdiction, but who had had access to accounts under indefinido. The intermediary had received payments that matched dates and amounts that could have been used to compensate hospital staff. Whether this man had been a conduit for a larger directive or an opportunist waiting for the right moment was a question that would be argued in depositions. The ledger had opened into the world. The world had several doors. Amanda sat one evening with Jacob, and they spoke not of law but of small things. They planned a picnic near a river where children could run. They arranged for Philip to visit the garage and to learn to change a tire. They planned for a tutor to come to the house for Peter and Philip both. The practicalities were a kind of soft reclamation. They had not yet parsed all the culpabilities. They had, for the present, the honest necessity of love. Mariam watched the rearrangement with a weary caution that was half mercy. She had not imagined this as a result of Jacob's past. She had not planned for her daughter to grow up in the shadow of a scandal. But she also saw something else. Jacob, who had been worn by indignity, was starting to stand with a slow pride. She watched him teach Philip to hold a wrench the way a man teaches a child to trust his hands. She felt absurdly a new sense of family taking shape that was not tidy, but was resilient. The investigations took other turns. Witnesses who had been paid in hush money reluctantly came forward now that the law had started to pull on the threads. A nurse who had signed forms in a hurry testified that she had been short-staffed and paid small stipends by an intermediary. The intermediary's name, when traced, led them to a shell company whose list of officers included a person associated with a trust management firm. The chain was not a straight line. It was a tangle with knots. The fact that someone had an interest in a collateral line did not prove that the trust instructed an abduction in the cruel terms that had unfolded, but it provided motive many hands could have exploited. As the case took shape, Amanda began to face a complicated question that had no legal answer. What to do about Peter? He had been raised in her house and loved in such a way as to make his childhood both cushioned and complicated. She could not simply erase her bond with him. At the same time, she had a new child who wanted the right to claim his father under a law that acknowledged blood. The simplest moral answer was not the simplest human path. She consulted child psychologists and social workers. They advised a gradual expansion of family, recognition of Philip as her son, while ensuring Peter retained his security and place. The counsel was not a directive. It was an attempt to give language to what people were already feeling. Legal filings began to place people in different roles: accused, witness, beneficiary. The press offered quick headlines: Billionaire's child swap scandal, and then moved on to other dramas. But the private workings of the family, the ledger of conversations at dinner, the way the two boys learned to share toys, those things did not make news. They braided into the daily life of repair. Amanda found two small joys in the midst of the dark mess. Philip learned to trust a woman who had made mistakes and had been deceived, and Jacob found ways to be present that did not cost him his dignity. The ledger did not supply any of those reparations. Only the slow, patient work of people loving imperfectly would do that. Then, as if the ledger was not content merely to be a map, it offered another clue: an email header in a foreign folder. Subject: confirmation requested, Okoro collateral nominees, indefinido. The body was sparse, a request for confirmation of genealogy before allocation. Attached was a list of names, some of which were unknown to investigators, some of which matched surnames from rural districts. A notation at the bottom, retain confidentiality per counsel, indefinido, suggested deliberate obfuscation. The chain now stretched not only across families, but across borders. Amanda read the attachment and understood that the ledger had not been a simple path of greed. It had been an instrument flexible enough to be used by those who read contingency as permission. That reality did not change her immediate feelings toward Amarka. It complicated how she understood the architecture of responsibility in her family. The police admitted publicly only that the investigation into human trafficking had led to arrests and that charges were pending. Behind that press release, investigators were following a path of emails, of small transfers, and a corpus of handwriting. They chased an offshore manager whose passport stamped travel to a series of bank centers. It was the kind of hunt that could take months, that could lodge itself in courtrooms half a continent away. The ledger had opened a door that was wide enough to be frightening. One evening, as Amanda closed an early meeting, a junior investigator sent a note. We have a witness in Lagos who remembers a meeting in 1999. The witness says an Okoro elder met a manager from Atlas Trust, indefinido, and discussed contingencies for lines of succession. We will pursue this. The message was technical and small. Amanda felt it like a footstep in a corridor connecting a vast house of secrets. She went home and found Philip asleep in a chair with a book fallen over his knee. Peter lay on a rug, each breathing in the kind of rhythm that suggested both exhaustion and a child's ability to restart. Amanda sat and watched them until the weight of the day made the edges of her eyes heavy. She felt as if the ledger's seam had been slit and new life was pouring out of it, unknown and dangerous and strangely liberating. There would be depositions and hearings. There would be more counting of envelopes and the careful mapping of travel histories. There would be arguments about the interpretation of contingency, of whether a deed intended to provide for unforeseen orphanhood could be maliciously converted into justification. The law would argue semantics. The family would argue sorrow. And yet the immediate house hummed with something less jurisprudential, an odd reclamation. Aunties who had once whispered about Amanda's choices now came to bring tinned stew and to watch the children play. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down now offered to drive Jacob to the garage on rain days. The ledger had not simply exposed betrayal. It had, in its exposure, loosened old, brittle connections and allowed for new ones. The ledger remained unresolved. Its lines opened doors rather than closed them. Investigators had traced transfers and flagged names in margins. Indefinido repeated like a small, stubborn refrain. It suggested both an answer and an absence of one. Whoever had used the trust's contingency clause as a rationale had left fingerprints in the ledger. Those prints led to names that sometimes matched people who had been dead for years, and sometimes to fresh accounts in jurisdictions that were legally impenetrable. Amanda would not sleep easily for months. She had, in one gesture of stubborn compassion, chosen to keep both boys under her roof, while the law did its job. She was accused in some circles of sentimental indulgence and applauded in others as magnanimous. Neither judgment mattered to her in the way a child's small breath did at night. In that way, the case came to a practical pause. The arrests proceeded, interviews were scheduled, deposits were examined, a warrant was issued for a travel document in a foreign country. The bank account trail shone intermittently and then receded. It had opened a wound and had revealed people who would have to answer for their choices. But it did not present a single hand that could be said to have been the mastermind, only a braid of many decisions, some cruel, some cowardly, some opportunistic, all converging on one awful moment. 2 minutes in a hospital that made the rest of a life. On a bright afternoon some weeks later, as the trial calendar was being tentatively set, Amanda sat in the garden with a file of papers. A new letter had arrived from an accounting firm in another city, old name, careful script, referencing a dormant allocation and a request for confirmation. They had asked for a simple genetic confirmation before proceeding. It was a bureaucratic step, the kind that implies an institutional belief in lines and inheritance. Amanda folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. The ledger would continue to hum. Jacob stood in the doorway and watched Amanda tend the children as if she were adjusting a lantern's flame to keep it from guttering. He thought about the ledger and the strange way money had been turned into a reasoning for human cruelty. He thought about his daughter Helen and the ways the world had already taught her to be small. He thought about Philip, asleep with an open book, mouth slack in the way of sleeping boys, and he felt an odd gratitude that would not be poetic. It was practical, as all good things are. He could teach the boy to change a tire and to read a bill. He could show him that hands that work can also be trustworthy. They had not reached conclusions about the ledger's deepest meaning. There were names they could not yet place, and hands they could not yet see. The trustee's memorandum, the offshore agent's note, the transferred sums labeled indefinido, these were clues, and clues are not confessions. The bank account that first promised to be merely an accounting curiosity had become a moral fulcrum. It connected a poor mechanic to a billionaire's bloodline, and it revealed that the architecture of inheritance could be weaponized by those who read contingency as permission. The house was slowly remaking itself. It was not a happy ending, but it was the only honest one they had. Amanda held both boys one evening and felt the particular rightness of shoulders belonging to children who were presently warm and breathing. They did not fix the ledger. They did not unravel the small, legalized cruelty that had allowed a woman to think she could justify a swap. But they made a decision about love. It would be large enough to include contradictions and small enough to hold the fragile things in it. As night came, a final note arrived from the investigator. A short line, crisp as a blade. Preliminary arrests made. Evidence suggests payments from trustee channeled via agent, indefinido. International inquiry ongoing. We will need to pursue council contacts named in the memorandum. The note offered no resolution, only more of the same. Questions. Amanda placed the note on her desk and stood at the window. The city lights were small and indifferent. She thought of the two children asleep under her roof. She thought of Jacob and Mariam and Helen and Ruth at the orphanage, who had been kind enough to do the right thing when kindness cost them something. She pressed her hand to the envelope marked Atlas Trust, indefinido, as if physical contact might give her a new fact. It did not. It offered only the persistent hum of possibility. Somewhere in the labyrinth of ledgers, a name was waiting to be properly seen. Someone had thought to use a contingency clause as leverage. Someone else had cut themselves a role in that plan. The account had been the hinge. It had opened a door and revealed more rooms. But which rooms would yield the true motive, the contracted cruelty, or the cynical reading of a trust, remained indefinido. Amanda turned off the lamp and found Peter's small hand in the dark. Philip slept with a book over his chest like a shield. Jacob met Amanda's eyes for a second, and they communicated what lawyers had not yet been able to. A shared decision to keep living in the interior of the truth, however patchworked it was. The ledger would continue to be chased. The offenders would be asked to answer. The bank account evidence would lead to other names, perhaps to people who had never imagined their handwriting would be read as instruction. For now, the family would be held together by dinner plates and the dull domestic geometry of daily life. Breakfast, bus rides, school bags, and the kind of small patience that is the breath of relationships. The ledger remained a dangerous promise on Amanda's desk. It would not be the instrument of a simple moral balance. It would be the hinge of a longer story, one that would reveal more names and perhaps a wider intent. She locked the drawer, left the house, and went to sleep with the strange comfort of someone who has found a child and lost a piece of absolute certainty. In the morning, they would all rise and perform the ordinary gestures of care. They would also, quietly, continue to demand answers from a bank account whose notes were still written in a hand they were learning to read. There were more hearings to come. There were